At CIT, we believe in turning ideas into outcomes, bringing goals into focus, and empowering you to achieve them. We know that takes agility, and we've got it. A century of experience also comes in handy, and we've got that too. Whether you're growing your business, building your savings, or seeking that next equipment purchase, we're the bank for you. With CIT, you can build like you, grow like you, save like you, bank like you. So let's get going.
Welcome back. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm William Pickle. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Brilliant Corners, and I'm also a very proud member of Housing California's Board of Directors. I'd like to thank once again all of our conference sponsors and to thank all of you for being here. And I'm truly honored to introduce the amazing panelists for our next session, which is entitled Achieving Equitable Housing and Homelessness Policy in Washington, D.C., from COVID-19 to long-term solutions. Our panel today includes both governmental and non-governmental national affordable housing and homelessness leaders. Peggy Bailey and Richard Cho bring decades of housing and homelessness policy experience to their current roles as senior advisors at HUD. We're also going to hear from Diane Yentl, President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, as well as Nan Roman, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. As most of you will know, both the Coalition and the Alliance do incredible work advancing our shared agenda. So it's no wonder that Housing California works closely with both organizations. For example, Housing California is the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's California partner on their bold national campaign called, appropriately enough, Housed. So these are our panelists who, as they say, need no further introduction. So with that, it is my pleasure to hand it over to Diane, who will move us into the session.
Great, thank you, Bill. And thanks to Housing California for having us here. Thanks to all of you for joining this conversation on achieving equitable housing and homelessness policy in DC. So I'm Diane Yentl, President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I'm glad to moderate this discussion with my colleagues to talk about the tremendous opportunities that we have before us to do just that. So 2020 clearly and obviously was one of the most extraordinary and difficult years in our lifetimes. And it truly was a watershed year. It showed us in profound and unforgettable ways who we are as a country, and we can't go back. 2020 showed us the deep structural racism on which our country and so many of its systems was built, and how that structural racism harms and kills Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it made clear our collective responsibility to repair this deep injustice, to work towards racial and housing justice. And the year reveals the collective harm that comes from allowing homelessness and housing poverty to persist. There is nothing quite like a highly contagious and deadly disease to make clear that housing is healthcare. It always has been. And that stable, safe, affordable, accessible homes are a prerequisite to personal and public health. The year revealed in new ways the pervasive housing crisis for the lowest income people who struggled so mightily to pay rent pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, and who will continue to struggle after the pandemic, unless and until the federal government invests in solutions to make homes affordable to those lowest income people. And the year showed us as housing advocates, organizers, providers, tenant leaders, impacted people, just how deep and broad is our movement for housing justice, and how powerful and effective we can be. Because as difficult as the year was, we rose to the challenge, and together we achieved unprecedented resources and protections for renters and unhoused people. So for over a year now, the National Income Housing Coalition has mobilized over 2,300 organizations for solutions to keep the lowest income renters and unhoused people safe, healthy, and housed during the pandemic. We worked closely with people directly impacted by housing stability and with local, state, and national partners, with congressional champions around our collective demand for rent relief now, calling for a broad national eviction moratorium and emergency rental assistance. And together, collectively, we achieved both, as well as new resources to address homelessness in communities. So now we have a tremendous obligation and opportunity to use these resources well, to reduce homelessness, to eliminate rent and utility arrears accrued during the pandemic, to center racial equity, and to provide housing stability. And we have an opportunity to keep going, to build on the success and on this opportunity and need before us to address and resolve the underlying housing crisis and systemic racism that brought us to the brink of an eviction tsunami during a pandemic. And it really is a once in a lifetime opportunity we have before us, with a president and a HUD secretary who talk about housing as a human right and have committed to universal housing vouchers, with congressional champions, in some cases bipartisan champions, who are ready to advance towards these goals, and with Congress and the White House currently negotiating a multi-trillion-dollar bill or bills on infrastructure. So we're going to talk about all of this now, the immediate opportunities and challenges, the opportunities for long-term systemic change, and how we achieve it all. And I can't think of a better panel to discuss this with than the one here today. On our panel, we have Peggy Bailey, currently Senior Advisor for Rental Assistance to HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge, and former Vice President for Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Richard Cho, currently Senior Advisor for Housing and Services to Secretary Fudge, formerly Executive Director of the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, and Nan Roman, President and CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. So for all of you who are participating, please put questions for the panelists in the Q&A box as they come to you, and I'll do my best to get most of them answered throughout the conversation. So we have lots to talk about, so let's dive in. And Richard, I'm gonna ask you to start us off by sharing an overview of President Biden's and Secretary Fudge's commitment to addressing homelessness and of the administration's priorities and plans to do just that, to deploy housing and homelessness resources from the American Rescue Plan.
Sure thing, Diane, and thank you. And what a great set of welcoming and introductory remarks, Diane. I would say, let me start by saying this. I mean, I think I've had this kind of Charles Dickens phrase going on in my head for the last several months, which is that it's been the best of times and it's also the worst of times. We, are, as Diane noted, coming out of one of the worst years ever with regard to a number of different housing challenges. I would say as somewhere at the top of that list are the challenges that people experiencing homelessness have faced. In January of 2020, when COVID first arrived in our country, there were more than 500,000 people experiencing homelessness, sleeping in congregate crowded shelters or on the streets. When the emergency declaration came in, a number of state leaders said, stay safe by staying home. There were more than 500,000 people who could not do so. They had to either choose between sleeping 6 inches apart, having no ability to physically distance, or having to sleep outside with no access to hygiene facilities, and where public health response efforts that were bringing vaccines and other response efforts to people, in various settings, people experiencing homelessness had a hard time accessing those. So, the last year has been particularly difficult for people experiencing homelessness. I know, it's been very clear in Secretary Fudge's remarks that ending homelessness is her top priority at HUD, and she's recognized the particular plight and challenges that people experiencing homelessness have faced over the last year. But, it's not only about addressing the immediate kind of COVID-related impacts of homelessness. This is about the fact that, we should not have had homelessness on the rise when COVID arrived in our country. In 2010 through 2016, we saw decreases in homelessness at a rate of about 13% from 2010 to 2016, much steeper for veterans, slightly steeper for families. But overall, homelessness decreased. And that was at a time when there were no new resources. We had sequestration within Congress. So federal agencies were being told to cut their budgets, not let alone ask for more funds. but you saw through really impressive work at the community level, communities shifting towards better evidence-based practices, towards a housing-first approach. You saw them be able to achieve reductions in homelessness across all populations, chronic homelessness, family homelessness, veteran homelessness. And so we know that it's possible to reduce homelessness even without new resources. Fast forward to now, you have a president and Secretary Fudge who are making reducing homelessness a top priority. And we have now a historic opportunity through the resources provided in the American Rescue Plan. We have $5 billion in emergency housing vouchers, so 70,000 emergency housing vouchers that we've awarded. The initial tranche of those funds have been awarded to communities the week before last that provide housing authorities and their team of care partners resources to be able to begin leasing people up in the next month. We've provided funding to provide 18 months of rental assistance that we will continue to renew. In addition, we've provided allocations of about $5 billion in grants. We know that vouchers are critical to be able to help people rehouse those that are experiencing homelessness in the near term. But we also know that we are all competing for the same vacant apartments in the private market. And so we need to build additional housing units. The home funds that we've awarded, the $5 billion in home funds through the American Rescue Plan, provide communities with resources that we hope communities will use to add to their stock of dedicated, affordable, and supportive housing to address the needs of people experiencing and at risk of homelessness. And then beyond that, as I'm sure my colleague Peggy will know, we are not stopping there. The American Rescue Plan is about helping us achieve our current needs, but both through our FY22 budget as well as in the American Jobs Plan, we're asking for significant resources to be able to essentially build back better, to get to the place where we're not only trying to reduce homelessness to pre-COVID levels, but eradicate homelessness, as well as to address the affordable housing needs across the board. And so maybe Diane, I'll leave it there, but happy to add to that some more.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And Nan, I'll turn to you next. The National Alliance to End Homelessness has been leading efforts to ensure that these funds that Richard talked about, the $10 billion, are used to reduce homelessness in communities. So can you talk about some of the work that you've been doing and some of the advice you have on how this $10 billion from the American Rescue Plan can be used in a transformational way to address homelessness in communities?
Sure. Thanks so much, Diane. And thanks also to Housing California for inviting me to join you today and for your leadership in the state and nationally. And it's great to be here, as Diane said, with Peggy and Richard, long-term colleagues in the fight. Sadly, I don't need to tell you all that California is in a league of its own when it comes to homelessness. Your increases here in the state are driving the national numbers. You have by far the most people experiencing homelessness, about 40% more than the next most affected state. And more than half of the nation's unsheltered people live in California, 9 times more than the next highest state, which is Texas. So obviously you have a big problem and therefore quite a steep slope to climb to address that problem. However, I have to say, as others have already, that at the moment, because of the resources on the table, you probably have a far better chance of making a significant reduction in homelessness than you've ever had before. But it will not be easy. And it's quite possible that if the resources are not used strategically, while they will help people, that's for certain, homelessness won't be reduced. So that's the challenge before us. I know that you have what looks like at least $10 billion in the state budget, and you'll get more funds from the American Rescue Plan Act for emergency housing vouchers and home funds, as Richard mentioned. You may also have access to some of the $26 billion in the American Rescue Plan money that the state will give to California. I know that some of those funds have been used for homelessness in the past, I think on Home Key, if I'm not mistaken. And there's also CARES Act money and other vouchers at HUD and very robust funding requests from the administration for homeless and housing programs moving forward. So as I say, I think the real question is, how can these resources be used strategically to reduce the number of people who are currently homeless? There are a few key values that I would think about in terms of using these funds in your planning, which of course I'm sure you've all started already, about how to use them. If we want to use them to really make a dent in homelessness. The first thing would be to use the money, as I said, to the maximum extent possible to reduce the number of people who are currently experiencing literal homelessness. The second thing is to use the money, again, to the extent possible, to help people with the highest needs. This is certainly because they are the most in need of assistance, but also because people with high needs tend to stay homeless the longest, which creates more unsheltered homelessness and which stops you from helping more people exit the system. Third is to use the funds in ways that reduce the disproportionate number of BIPOC populations who are homeless and to reduce any disparities in the homelessness system. The homelessness system actually doesn't have so much to do with creating the racial disproportionality in homelessness. That is the result of historical and systemic racism and of disparities in the feeder systems into homelessness, like the criminal justice system and the foster care system. But we can reduce those disproportionalities. And the homeless system can definitely use data to identify disparities in how it serves people and take steps to remediate those disparities. The fourth value is to create solid partnerships between continuums of care, public housing authorities, home offices, and healthcare entities. If you have such partnerships, that is great. But I think it's important to recognize that relationships and responsibilities may change given the new configuration of resources that are on the table. So if it was me, the first thing I would be thinking about doing right now to get started is to set priorities as to who is going to be housed, because of course it won't be everyone. So that's the strategic part of the question. A couple of thoughts on that. First, I would say I would not recommend that you use these funds, the emergency housing vouchers and home, to prevent homelessness. If you want to prevent homelessness, use funds in the emergency rental assistance program, the coronavirus relief funds, the American Rescue Plan utility assistance, TANF emergency assistance. There are billions more dollars in those programs to prevent homelessness. Plus, since by far the majority of people who are evicted do not become homeless, and we really can't predict who will, you're very unlikely to reduce homelessness if you use homeless funds for prevention. In terms of who should be prioritized for housing, every community has a different homeless population, and so your priorities, I'm sure, will differ. Rather than have a single file line of people teed up for housing, you might instead want to create buckets or categories of strategically chosen candidates for housing. I choose those categories based on need and the availability, or the ability rather, to reduce the size of the homeless population and to reduce racial disproportionality and disparities. So categories, for example, might include people who are unsheltered, people who are disabled, long-term shelter stayers, people over 55, or families with children under 6. You can maintain groups of people in each of these categories whose paperwork and preparatory steps are complete so that when a unit is available, an appropriate tenant is ready to move in and things move fast. While committing to as many high-need people as possible, there are likely to be times when you don't have the services that high-need people need. And you should be prepared to supply tenants who are literally homeless but already have or do not require services in those cases. For example, you could turn to lower acuity people who are unsheltered, people living in cars, people who are working, etc., or to long-term shelter stayers who don't require services or who have a services connection. You could also house tenants that are ready to move on from permanent supportive housing, because if you do that, that would free a PSH unit for a high need person. So it would contribute to reducing the number of people who are currently homeless. People we would not really recommend prioritizing are people in rapid rehousing unless they were explicitly placed in rapid rehousing while waiting for PSH, or they are literally about to be evicted. Otherwise, people in rapid rehousing, helping them is not going to reduce homelessness. Most people in rapid rehousing do not become homeless again, even though it may look like they will, and they may not be staying in the same unit. Also, we'd recommend against wholesale providing assistance to people who've been quarantining or isolating in hotels and motels, unless they are very high need. We recommend not to be focusing on those populations just because the jurisdiction doesn't want to be seen as putting people out or in shelter who have been in hotels and motels. Another priority at the moment is for the COCs and the PHAs to be negotiating about who does what. This is a new partnership for many jurisdictions. You'll have to decide who finds and secures the units, how the paperwork gets done, who chooses the tenants, who secures the services, and so forth. There are a lot of decisions to be made. I'll stop here, but in summary, I'd say there are a lot of resources on the table. There are enough to make a dent in homelessness. It's going to be difficult to do that. But if we don't take the more difficult strategic route, while people will be helped, homelessness will not be reduced. And what we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to do is to reduce homelessness. So at the Alliance, we're really tremendously grateful for the commitment and the determination of Secretary Fudge. And it's just fantastic to have Richard and Peggy and all their colleagues there who have shown that they know how to make this unprecedented investment matter. The real work, though, is going to be up to those of you in the field. And I certainly hope that we can succeed. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Nan. That's really helpful guidance and priorities. And I want to stick with the resources from the American Rescue Plan. And Peggy, certainly the $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance that's provided in the American Rescue Plan and the December stimulus altogether, it flows through the Department of Treasury, of course, but HUD has been very active in partnering with the agency to ensure that these funds reach the households most in need. So can you talk a bit about those efforts and about what more you think can be done, especially as we approach the possible end of the federal eviction moratorium?
Sure, Diane, thank you for that. And thank you, Housing California, for inviting me here today to be a part of this panel. Yeah, so, when I came to HUD, I wouldn't have necessarily guessed how much we're going to be working with Treasury for pretty much definitely this term of the Biden administration. And that's and it's been great. We have great partners at Treasury. Treasury has hired several housing experts that are a real partner with HUD and have expertise in the homelessness space in particular, which has been of a significant value to how they're administering the programs. So what I would say, first of all, is what we've really tried to do is lean into each of our expertise, right? The almost $50 billion of emergency rental assistance was given to Treasury because Treasury is great at getting dollars out the door. What Treasury doesn't typically do is have to administer programs and help communities stand up new programs so much. They usually send out dollars and then come later to see how those dollars were spent. Well, it was really important to us at HUD to make sure that that there was a strong hand in helping communities administer these programs so that no one ran afoul of the statute and faced punitive problems once the Inspector General came after the fact. We know that that's a real problem. It's happened in the past with Treasury dollars, and we didn't want that to happen again, or at least do everything that we could to prevent that from happening. So we worked really closely with Treasury on the frequently asked questions that have served as the guidance for how to administer both the emergency rental assistance programs that have been appropriated, really leaning into being explicit about these resources reaching the hardest to serve people who need help the most, and communities leaning in to the flexibility that Treasury and Congress have given to the program to do everything that you can to reduce the barriers to access to resources and make sure that people can self-attest to their need, self-attest to how much money they owe in rent. All of the, we've learned a lot from the homelessness system, really, to be clear on what those barriers are to assistance, and tried to make as clear as possible that with the emergency rental assistance program, those barriers should be limited. We're also partnering when it comes to technical assistance and getting assistance out to the field to help do, as Nan advised, really help communities be strategic about which resources go to which population, but hopefully do that in a way that's seamless, so that we're not making people enter into different doors, where people can enter into one door and we use the appropriate resources to serve that person as they present to us. So what we're doing right now is providing technical assistance to HUD grantees using HUD resources to help them align resources and use some of the tools that the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the Center on Budget Policy Priorities, and others have put together to help provide communities with a framework around ending homelessness. Then we're continuing to talk to Treasury about ways that HUD can also provide technical assistance to Treasury grantees in the future, to make sure. It was really important to us that we know that what often happens in these relief, there are big packages of resources, and this is an unprecedented amount of resources, so could definitely happen, that communities get one TA provider for the emergency voucher program, and another TA provider for the emergency solutions grants, and another TA provider for the emergency rental assistance program. And you end up in a situation where you need to hire someone to manage the TA providers, which is not the most useful way to use your resources. So we're trying to figure out ways that we can kind of break down the silos at the federal level to make it easier for all of you at the local level. And there'll be more to come along those lines. I think what more can be done is, with flexibility is a double-edged sword, right? We know that you need flexibility at the local level to address local issues and that are unique. But that means there's no template or clear marching instructions on how to set up these new programs. And that creates, that's one of the reasons why some of the emergency rental assistance has been slow to get out the door. So what we hope is that you're encouraging communities to lean into this flexibility, to reduce the barriers, and definitely reporting back to us on what the best practices are that you're seeing out in the field, so that we can promote them and let others replicate them. And also letting us know what some of the challenges were. For example, in California, we know that in the first tranche of emergency rental assistance dollars, the state put in a limitation on how much back rent could be paid, that landlords could only be paid 80% of their back rent due. We heard about the challenges that created in landlords agreeing to participate in the program. We, along with others, helped the state think through that policy and are really excited that the state is rethinking that policy for the future. And hope that will help more landlords come to the table in California and speed up getting the rental assistance out the door. So that's just an example to say that this is a two-way conversation that the administration wants to set up with you, between you and us. And whether you're talking to me or Richard or talking to Treasury, know that we're meeting at least weekly to discuss what we're hearing from the field, ways that we can help the dollars move out the door. And because for all of us, the most important thing is making sure that people who need the help the most get it as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Peggy. And I will just attest to how grateful I am that you and Richard and others with deep, deep expertise on housing and also on working with an outreach to marginalized people and marginalized communities are at the center of this work. And just to also say that, you know, the National Income Housing Coalition, we have been doing a lot of tracking and analyzing and research on what's working and what's not within the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And as we've lifted up trends, troubling trends that we've seen or obstacles that we're aware of, you know, you, Peggy, and others within HUD and Treasury in the White House have been so responsive and taken it very seriously and prioritized removing those obstacles quickly to get that money out the door. And we've been very appreciative of that. And I would also just make a plug to people in California. As Peggy said, it is so good to see the state of California course correcting now to improve its program. And, you know, that's what we need to see throughout the country and in other communities throughout California. We need to see a willingness from program administrators to recognize what's not working and not be afraid to make those course corrections along the way. And so I would love to see the governor's office talk about it in that way. Talk about, you know, having tried something for the first time, this massive new program, learning lessons from it, and then making corrections and improving along the way. I think that would go a long way towards encouraging other communities to act similarly. So there's a couple questions that have come in that I'm gonna ask so that we stick first with the short term, the immediate, the American Rescue Plan funds. And there's a couple of questions related to services that Richard, maybe I'll ask you first and invite others to add on. But one question asking about where communities can find funding for supportive services to couple with vouchers and units for people experiencing homelessness. And then similarly related from Joshua Bamberger asking this fantastic increase in housing vouchers, maybe outstripping funding for services. Any advice as to where to find funding to have supportive services and permanent supportive housing? I don't think Medicaid is the solution, says Joshua. So Richard, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll take that up, Josh. So I mean, I was just on a call, and by the way, you know, we're in daily communication with jurisdictions all the time, and many people are coming to us with lots of questions, and I encourage all of you in California to do the same. We at HUD here are doing our best to be responsive, and you know, the federal government doesn't always have the reputation of being easy to access, but our job here is to ensure that we are working in close partnership with communities and with mayors, governors, county leaders across the country to help ensure that these resources are being used strategically and quickly to address multiple housing crises, from homelessness to evictions and more. On the question of supportive services, you know, the call I had with the jurisdiction today, the folks there were like, well, we know these vouchers are not coming with service dollars, and so we're planning to use them to serve people who don't have high service needs. And Nan mentioned that certainly is one of the strategies you can do. And while it would have been great for us to be able to award these vouchers alongside a package of services grants, it's just not how the funds will work. On the other hand, I do want to make everyone aware of all the really numerous opportunities through the American Rescue Plan that were provided through HHS. The list is perhaps too long to share, but everything from enhanced substance abuse prevention and treatment block grants that states receive, where housing related activities is an explicit purpose. States received a significant supplement to their substance abuse prevention treatment block grants. Health centers, community health centers received $6 billion to cover a range of activities that includes enabling services. So services that can be used to provide housing navigation and homeless outreach and connections and referrals to vouchers, even some ongoing supportive services, community health workers. To Josh's point, Josh Bamberger's point that Medicaid's not the answer, well, let me point out that the American Rescue Plan included a provision that is providing a 10% federal increase in the federal match to Medicaid for existing home and community-based services. So this is a little technical, so let me try to do my best to explain this. So states that are already funding home and community-based services will get an automatic 10% increase in federal matching funds. So in California, if California typically covers 50% of the cost of these home and community-based services, the federal government's now going to cover 60% rather than 50%, and so California now wants to pay 40%. Nationally speaking, that translates to, we believe, about $12 billion that states are receiving. What that does is that frees up the money that would have otherwise been set aside to cover the state share of those funds. And those state funds are not to be used to plug other budget holes, but states have to use those state savings that result from the enhanced federal match for other housing and services related activities. That includes providing wraparound services for people who are either leaving institutions or transitioning into housing from homelessness. That's explicitly in the CMS guidance, which I understand is fairly technical, so it's not easy for folks to understand. All that all of you as housers really need to know is that you should be talking with your Medicaid agencies at the state and at the county level, because I know in California there's county involvement, about how that enhanced federal match for home and community-based services enables state and county dollars to be freed up that could be used to provide wraparound supportive services. I spoke to a state just earlier this week where they've already proposing to CMS that they want to use several $1 million out of that pool of state funds that have been freed up through that enhanced match to fund those wraparound services. So Medicaid is challenging to use, but this enhanced federal match is actually freeing up state dollars that have been set aside for Medicaid related services, but can now be used for a much more flexible set of services without a reimbursement structure. So again, state dollars have been now freed up that can fund wraparound services, such as through grants or contracts to nonprofit organizations. So definitely take that up. I'm happy to speak further with anyone who has more questions about that. But I do think it's really important that housing authorities, COCs, and those of you who work on homelessness issues understand that the emergency housing vouchers, while they didn't come with off-the-shelf service dollars, there's a lot of ways to find funding for wraparound services that could be paired with that, as well as for the home grants that we provided that will hopefully be used to add to the stock of affordable and supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness.
Great, thanks, Richard. Nan or Peggy, anything else you wanted to add on related to services?
Not really. I would just say, when I spoke before, I said things weren't going to be easy, and Richard has just explained one of the reasons why. And the money, the $10 billion was given to home and to the public housing authorities, and not to the COCs. That's okay, but obviously neither one of those are experts on homelessness. And so these new partnerships have to be formed, and everybody always talks about partnerships, and it's not the most exciting strategy in the world, but it really is going to be needed. And the same is true with the services. There is just a lot of money on the table for everything, really. And the question is, are you building the partnerships to access those resources? There's $400 billion, I think, for home and community-based services in the proposed, I know we're supposed to only be talking about the Rescue Plan Act service money, but coming up in the next bill. So I think a lot of services money is going to be there, but it's all going to be a little bit of a challenge to put together.
Thanks, Nan. And thanks, Richard. So there's another question that maybe can help us start to bridge into continue to talk about the short term and also the long term. That comes from Brisa Yepes, who asks, what are the plans in outreach to BIPOC, tribal, and low-income communities? How do you plan to provide secure and meaningful housing to these families? And I'll ask that of any of the panelists. Peggy, looks like you're ready.
Yeah, I can start with that. So one of the real joys of coming to HUD has been building a stronger relationship that I hadn't really worked on before with the Office of Native American Programs. So I'll start with the tribal piece of that question. It's been talking about unprecedented resources, both the end of year appropriations bill and the American Rescue Plan included resources specifically to tribal nations. In the first bucket of money from the appropriations bill, that money is a carve out of the emergency rental assistance program that Treasury's run. So that money went to tribes from Treasury using our Native American housing programs formula, the Indian Housing Block Grant formula to tribes. To say that ONAP has provided advice to Treasury on how to get these resources out, how to communicate with tribes, what the frequently asked questions guidance should look like is almost an understatement. They have heavily relied on HUD's expertise to make sure that these resources are going to tribal nations, that the reporting is appropriate for the tribes, and the uses align as best as possible to the uses that they're used to, and this included resources to the Native Hawaiian grantee as well. And then in the American Rescue Plan, Relief Plan, we realized, you know what, carving out resources for the tribes from a mainstream program is not the way to go. We really need to provide tribes with resources through the normal mechanisms that to reduce the administrative burden on the tribe. So that's what happened the second time. And another tranche of resources went to the tribal nations through that mechanism. Now what we're doing is, what's great is that Secretary Fudge and Secretary Holland knew each other from Congress, so have a strong relationship already, and already have high on their list of priorities to collaborate between HUD and the Department of Interior to work together to overcome a lot of the challenges that we've faced in improving housing in Indian country, and we can't be more excited about the potential of that partnership. And then, thinking in the future, if we're able to pass the American Jobs Package as proposed by the president, there's another $2 billion dedicated to tribal nations in that proposed as well. Now, reaching BIPOC populations is another issue, is another priority for Secretary Fudge and the administration. And what we've done along those lines is, one, make sure we're providing the flexibility to communities that Congress intended, so that marginalized communities that often face the largest barriers to benefits and supports don't have to have those barriers, assuming localities lean into that flexibility. We also are orienting our technical assistance to make sure that we're providing technical assistance to help communities think about equity and how to reverse past practices that have contributed to discriminatory and disproportionate outcomes for people of color. The last piece is we're working very heavily at HUD with the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity to really think about fair housing as it relates to both getting these resources out and making sure that we're investing properly in communities, but also how, being on the offensive when it comes to evictions and things like that, so that we're explaining to communities how they can run afoul of the Fair Housing Act in order to prevent it, so that they know that we're watching and that we care, and that tenants know that they can report fair housing violations to HUD. So those are just some of the ways that we're trying to make sure that BIPOC and Native American populations get access to the resources and can and that we're working, as Nan and others have said, to not just be in the status quo when the crisis is over, but be in a better place.
Thanks, Peggy. Nan or Richard, anything you want to add? Nan, you touched on centering racial equity and serving BIPOC communities in some of the framework outreach. Anything else you want to add on centering historically marginalized people and communities?
Well, I think just to say more generally, can in terms of homelessness and subpopulations, if you're looking, for example, to address disproportionality, I mean, say African Americans, for example, greatly overrepresented in the homeless population overall, but somewhat less overrepresented in the unsheltered population. So if you're trying to make an impact there, you can look at subpopulations and figure out where you can make the most impact. There's need everywhere. Also, I think targeting marginalized communities or lower opportunity communities with resources as opposed to people is a good way to try to address some of those things. And then the other thing really is just to look at your data. We do collect a fair amount of data in the homelessness system. It's many jurisdictions don't use it very much, but that is where you can figure out if you're getting disparate, if you have disparities in your own system in terms of what you're doing for people. Even just looking at kind of the basic things of who is entering, who's getting shelter, how long they're staying, whether they're exiting to housing, and whether they come back into homelessness again. Those are kind of the basic metrics that you can start by looking at.
Thanks,
Diane,
Dan.
I'll just add briefly that, I mean, some of the other specific things we're doing. I mean, and I worked in a prior federal administration, the Obama administration, and equity was something that, we sort of worked on, but not in a very overt way. And I think we're coming into this administration where on day one, President Biden signed an executive order charging federal agencies to really look at ways that we can advance equity and reverse systemic racism. And again, even the fact that those words are coming from a president's mouth and from an executive order is groundbreaking, but also that we are now charged with conducting an equity assessment alongside other federal agencies. So we're at the beginning of that work, but it is something we're building into everything we do. And then kind of drilling down to some weeds, as Nan noted, one of the places where reasons why you see racial disparities in homelessness is because of the significant barriers that people of color and Black people in particular face because of involvement in the justice system and other public systems. Some of the steps that we're taking on that is to clarify the role that emergency housing vouchers can play in addressing the needs of people who are justice involved, as well as really drawing more attention and providing more specific tools on ways that we're discouraging landlords and housing providers to screen out people on the basis of criminal histories and criminal records. And so more to come on that in the coming days, actually. But we're doing a lot more to try to address some of the very reasons why people have been excluded from housing because of their involvement in criminal justice system where there's been practices that have perpetuated systemic racism.
Great, thanks, Richard. So there's a question, an anonymous question asking about programs that have wait lists and just how many of them are, and asking how do we get through the wait lists and actually provide housing to low-income families, which I think moves us really nicely into the next part of our conversation about the opportunities that we have for major investments in solutions through the American Jobs Plan, or whatever the infrastructure spending bills end up being called, and through the appropriations process. So Peggy, Richard talked earlier about the administration's commitment to ending homelessness, and of course it's all related. But if you could talk more about President Biden's and Secretary Fudge's commitment to housing as a human right and universal vouchers, and how we achieve that. What's the plan to get there?
Yes. So as you said, the Secretary and the President are committed to housing as a human right. I think embedded in that is the issue of equity for many marginalized populations, but particularly people of color, and others who have faced negative stereotypes about whether they deserve housing and whether they deserve assistance, and really being charged to reverse that idea and understand that everybody deserves a safe place to live. So that if anything drives what Secretary Fudge charges us to do every day, it's that our mission at HUD is to help the people who we serve, but also to help everyone get access to housing assistance. And so that leads into the universal voucher proposal. And while so the way that we're approaching that is to really think through how do we expand the voucher program to make sure that everyone can have access to it, and understanding. So the first step is proposing 200,000 housing vouchers. Sorry for my puppy. That's what I jumped because she just barged through the door. Is making sure that is the $200,000 voucher proposal, and getting and hopefully getting, you know, that small but important and historic increase to the voucher program would be really is a first step. Then the next piece is then really thinking through, what do we need to change about the current voucher program to be able to support, you know, a 75% increase in people getting assistance. That's not small. And we know that there are things that need to change about the current voucher program because it's built in an environment of scarcity. It's built because we know that we can't serve all of the people that need assistance. And so how would we redesign, make it easier for people to get their rental assistance? What should a housing inspection look like? How do we help PHAs partner together to make sure that vouchers can be used throughout the community? These are all things that we have to consider as we expand the voucher program. Simply adding money to the current system isn't going to be, won't help us sustain for the future. So that's what we intend to do once we get through the jobs package, is to start to bring together stakeholders to think about how to how should we design a universal program. And then, as you said, and Richard teed up, the American Jobs Package is designed to get at the supply part of the equation, right? We know that vouchers alone won't solve the problem. We've really got to create, especially in the large cities in California, we've got to create more supply. And so how do we do that? Well, it's going to take particularly what's most important from a HUD perspective is making sure that HUD programs are included in the infrastructure package, because it's our programs that partner with LIHTC to make sure that we have deeply affordable housing for people. So that we've proposed $45 billion for home. We've proposed $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. We've proposed additional resources for the home program and project-based vouchers, all of which are designed for new assistance to be partnered with LIHTC to create deeply affordable housing. And then we've also proposed other things that get at community investment. And of course, the $40 billion in public housing, all of which is trying to address the decades of disinvestment in this affordable housing supply and allow for the vouchers to be partnered with the supply so that we really have addressed the complete housing need for people and are no longer operating in this environment of scarcity.
So, I mean, we should just pause for a moment and recognize how thrilling it is to have this level of investments proposed by President Biden and Secretary Fudge. It's a total of $318 billion in investments that are being proposed, and that we really have an opportunity this year to achieve. Clearly, some of these proposals will only get through Congress if the Democrats decide to use the budget reconciliation process, which they are talking about and moving forward with, and we will certainly continue to push for. But some of these proposals already have bipartisan support. And so there's going to be other opportunities to advance them too, to expand vouchers, to expand eviction prevention. And Nan, you're testifying this week before the Senate Banking and Housing Committee on some of the bipartisan bills that our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign helped to develop and to advance. And last year at this conference, you and Peggy and I were here on a similar panel talking about Opportunity Starts at Home and our efforts to shape and advance these bills. So Nan, can you remind people who may not know what the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign is, and share updates on our work, both for the long-term vision and on some of the shorter term and somewhat smaller bipartisan opportunities to advance towards that vision.
Sure, I will, Diane. So Opportunity Starts at Home is an organization, or is an initiative, a campaign really, that the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the Alliance, the Center on Budget, and Children's Health Watch convened. When was it, Diane? 4 years ago, I think, about 4 years ago. And it really came together for two reasons. One is that well, I would say one is that the housing sector at the time, particularly the housing advocates, we were not really succeeding in getting resources or making our case, and housing was really not on the agenda. That has changed since then, and in part due to OSA, but in part due to, I think, things that have gone on around housing. But the second thing was the realization on the part of a lot of other sectors, the health sector, the education sector, the civil rights sector, the mental health sector, climate change, food justice, food, everything, all these other sectors, that they were having trouble achieving their goals because people did not have affordable, stable housing. And we pulled together those groups into the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign to work together to advocate for affordable housing. So non-housing groups advocating for affordable housing. And we do that nationally, but also part of OSA, I should just mention, is that it makes grants to states to pull together these kinds of coalitions also at the state level. And Housing California, I believe, is one of our partners in doing that. So that's been very successful because it's just broadened the advocacy around housing. And there are a bunch of bills on the table. There's the that OSA has promoted along with our the Center, the Alliance, and the Coalition and other groups. There's the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. It's a bipartisan bill from Senators Van Hollen and Young, and that would expand the supply of housing vouchers to with an additional 500,000 additional vouchers targeted to families, 100,000 vouchers every year for 5 years, and services and other things as well to try to help families locate in high opportunity communities if that is their wish. There's the Choice and Affordable Housing Act, which is a 500 million, starts to sound really small now, 500 million after all these stimulus bills, but it's a $500 million program to incentivize landlords to participate in rental assistance programs. In the homelessness arena, we have a lot of experience trying to incentivize landlords to participate in housing assistance programs because our tenants often don't look too good, pencil out too well. So those kinds of incentives, increasing deposits, holding on to units, holding on to a large number of units, reserving multiple units, acting as a third party if the landlord needs to do something about one of the referred tenants, those kinds of things that would support that. Senators, another bipartisan bill called the YIMBY bill, Yes in My Backyard, would discourage the use of discriminatory land use policies and remove barriers to more affordable housing in communities. Senators Brown and Blunt, I don't know if they managed to reintroduce this today, but if not, I think they'll be reintroducing it shortly. Not Brown and Blunt, sorry, Bennett and Portman have the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act that we had in the last session. That was a pilot. Now we have enough experience, I think, through emergency rental assistance that we can go to scale with this one, which takes a lot of steps to reduce evictions. The one OSA in particular had recommended was flexible assistance to households that basically can pay their rent but are living paycheck to paycheck. And if something interrupts their income, like their car breaks down or their child gets sick and they can't work, then they get evicted and enter this downward spiral, for want of a nail. So this provides flexible assistance so that those shorter term emergencies can be addressed and they don't lose their housing because of them. So there's a lot of stuff. Housing has really emerged on the federal agenda and in Congress, and in a surprisingly bipartisan way as well in some of these proposals.
Yeah, it is a really exciting moment. And Bill mentioned early in the introduction, the Housed campaign that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has also launched, the Housed campaign for universal, stable, affordable housing. And it's a parallel campaign to the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, where Opportunity Starts at Home is mobilizing non-housing sectors to advance more affordable housing investments. The Housed campaign is doing the same with the housing community and continuing the momentum that we built up over the last year. So we're towards the end of our discussion. We have a few really good questions that have come in that maybe we can get to most of them. So one, Brian Collins asked about noting that this is a great discussion on non-housing coalitions advocating for affordable housing development and initiatives, and asking about what groups we know of from the healthcare sector that are advocating for these sorts of housing reforms. So I will say that in the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, on our steering committee, which is now about 19 national organizations, and all except for the founding organizations are non-housing leaders. And in the healthcare sector, we have Children's Health Watch, as Nan mentioned. They're one of the founding partners. They're a group of pediatricians out of Boston Medical Center. And Community Catalyst, which is also a major healthcare advocacy organization. Beyond the steering committee, we have what we call our roundtable, and we have about 100 organizations that participate in that. And we have many housing groups there, including United Healthcare, American Academy of Pediatrics, and others. So definitely, and I'd say in that it's actually the healthcare sector where we have the strongest support and the greatest number of organizations that are working on this, because of a lot of the work that the homelessness advocacy community and practitioners and Peggy and Richard and Nan have done over the years on making that connection between housing as healthcare. So another question that came in that I will open to Peggy, maybe first, and Richard, anything you wanted to add about, I'll combine two questions. One is, how do we get landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers? And how do we expand accessible housing opportunities?
Sure, so I can start. I think on the first question of getting landlords to accept vouchers, one of the things that we're going to be lifting up at HUD is how accepting housing vouchers help landlords during the pandemic stay whole, right? That landlords who have participated in HUD programs didn't have as severe of a drop in rental costs, because the voucher program is designed to adjust as people's incomes adjust, whether that's adjusting up or adjusting down. And I think that can play, lifting up that message and explaining the role the voucher program played for landlords will be is essential in order to cut through some of the noise that's happened in states like Iowa that are allowing source of income discrimination to happen. The other things that we can do, though, are help. One of the pieces of the president's budget is to increase PHA, the Public Housing Authority's administrative fees. And by doing that, then that will help housing authorities institute innovative practices that attract landlords to the program, like setting up a landlord incentive pool that's been shown to attract landlords to the program, but not get used because, surprise, surprise, voucher tenants don't destroy units at any more of a rate than other people, and are very good renters. So it gives, it unfortunately kind of placates the stereotype that voucher holders might damage units, but in reality, it helps landlords attract to the program, and it doesn't get used at the rate that people think it's going to get used. We can also do similar things of helping landlords once we do the inspection of units, helping landlords address some of the minor issues in particular, and state and local resources could be used to help landlords in this respect. So those are just a couple of examples of things that we could do to attract landlords to the program. The other piece is how to create more accessible units. Well, this is a huge component of the jobs plan, because as we renovate housing, that housing will have to meet ADA and new building standards. So we're committed to making sure that we increase the availability of resources to retrofit multifamily units, and then also as we're creating brand new units, ensuring that those units are beyond ADA accessible, so that people with disabilities can access those units.
Great, thanks, Peggy. Richard, I see you want to add on, and I'll give you a chance to, but first I'm going to ask a different question of you and Nan. And Richard, I'll start with you, so feel free to add on to that one first. But what are some, and this comes in from Michael Arvizu, who asks, what are some effective channels or media or tactics that are being used to raise awareness of these resources that are available now in communities?
Sure. So let me build on sort of Peggy's great response on landlords. And I think the thing I'll just add is there's sort of two major challenges with identifying landlords willing to receive vouchers. One of them is finding landlords when competition is tight, and the other is convincing landlords to participate in the program. With regard to finding them, the new emergency housing vouchers come with additional administrative fees and service fees. And some of the ways that those fees can be used is to really do work to increase housing navigation services to find landlords, can be used for landlord incentives and ways to kind of incentivize their participation. I also want to point out something that we haven't talked about is one of the most important resources that I think communities can use to address homelessness and housing needs is actually not at HUD at all, and is not even the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program, but is the Treasury state and local relief funds that are highly flexible, $350 billion that communities can use. And if people aren't already thinking about how to use those funds to do things like landlord incentives or even to seed the creation of new housing projects, they should definitely be thinking about that. The other thing that we've done during COVID is provided housing authorities with a number of waivers that enable vouchers to be used more flexibly. For example, additional time to complete housing quality inspections, additional time to collect documentation so that those don't become barriers. I know many landlords have said, we would love to be a Section 8, a voucher landlord, but the process of HQS and other administrative issues is challenging. So that's the places where we're looking at flexibilities during COVID. But we're also going to take a hard look at which of those flexibilities we want to continue for the overall program, even beyond COVID. On the question about channels or media or tactics to raise awareness of resources, that's a constant struggle. I mean, we certainly provided guidance and notice. We've done multiple press events highlighting the American Rescue Plan resources, but we know, information doesn't come out, and there's just a lot of information coming out these days. One of the things that we're working on is ways to really more directly engage state and local leaders in the effort to end homelessness, where it's not, many mayors, county leaders, governors don't always focus on homelessness issues very directly. One of the things we want to do is be able to position them to really take on some more direct leadership over efforts to reduce homelessness, including American Rescue Plan resources. So more to come soon on that front. But a lot of this will be about how do we create a more direct channels of communication between the federal government and state and local leaders so they can take greater ownership and charge to embrace a housing first approach and to be able to bring more people into homes and to be able to really help respond to their questions in real time, understanding that the guidance that the federal government provides is not always easy to understand or find.
And Diane, I just want to quickly add that we've also built a really strong partnership with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and they're doing a lot of tenant-focused outreach and intending to do some media pieces as well. And I can put the link to what they're putting together in the chat.
Great, and I'm told I need to wrap it up, but I just want to ask you each one last 30 seconds each. what one thing would you advise people to do now to take advantage of this moment that we're in now?
I can start. I'd say I have two. It'll be real quick. I would formalize those partnerships right now because these decisions about how the resources are going to be used need to be made now. And I would be setting the priorities in terms of the populations you're going to house.
Since Dan already covered partnerships, which was going to be one of mine, and I had a hard time choosing, I would say to not hold back. I mean, the housing and the homelessness sector has so become accustomed to working in a mindset of scarcity that how can we house people who are homeless using vouchers, because won't that open the floodgates and more people will come into the homeless system? I think like there's this sort of mindset that like we'll never have enough resources, so let's not like be bold. I think this is the moment to realize that you have a friend in the White House, you have a friend at HUD leadership who is fighting for the resources to be able to help communities to address multiple housing needs. And like, this is the time to be able to show that the power of those resources is that if they're deployed quickly, we can see that we can solve major housing crises and homelessness rates. We've done that with veterans. We've cut veteran homelessness in half with significant investments. We can do it for all people experiencing homelessness now that we have significant resources.
And I would just say, don't let expediency make you skip the step of talking to people in the community and the people with lived experience. So make sure to not let the fact that you're moving 1,000 miles an hour mean that you forget to engage the people that you're trying to serve.
Great. Well, Peggy, Richard, Nan, thank you so much for your expertise and your commitment and your partnership in the work. I've really enjoyed the conversation today, so thanks for your time. And Bill, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Diane, and thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their true wealth of knowledge. And also, I would say a spiritual guidance there at the end, especially from Richard saying, hey, you've lived through the scarcity moment and it's time to feel that abundance is coming and we can do some special things together. On behalf of all of us at Housing California, I want to thank you all for your powerful voices and for your ongoing leadership. And then next, you're not going to want to miss a very special virtual screening and panel discussion on the Way Home documentary series presented by our partners at Kaiser Permanente. We're really proud to work with Kaiser to unveil season 2 of this remarkable series here at Housing California's second Unconference. We look forward to seeing everybody as well at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning for a welcome by trailblazer and progressive icon, Congresswoman Barbara Lee from California's 13th Congressional District, as well as concurrent workshops on hot topics, tenant-led justice movements, and housing and health. Later in the day, we're going to be talking to leaders in the Newsom administration, as well as with our closing keynote speaker, Michael Tubbs, a leading voice on guaranteed income. Plus, more workshops, music, exhibit booths, networking, HCD office hours, and meditation and movement. So see you all tomorrow morning, hopefully at 9 a.m. sharp, and thank you all for attending this wonderful panel.